A bobcat appears at a woman's window every day, its piercing gaze unrelenting, as if it's trying to tell her something. At first, she dismisses it as just an odd encounter with nature. But when she discovers a cryptic letter in her late father's belongings, warning of the guardian's return, everything changes. What is the bobcat guarding? Why is it leading her deeper into the secrets of her family's past? And when the unthinkable finally happens, will it destroy everything she thought she knew, or unlock a truth that changes her life forever? Don't miss this breathtaking story of mystery, legacy, and redemption. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Clara Williams stirred in her bed as a gentle tapping sound pulled her from sleep. Her eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the soft morning light filtering through her bedroom window. The sound came again. Tap, tap, tap. From somewhere in the house, echoing through the quiet halls of her countryside home. "Must be those old maple branches," she mumbled, reaching for her worn blue cardigan draped over a nearby chair. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet as she made her way to the living room, running her fingers through her silver hair. The familiar scent of old books and polished wood filled her nostrils as she walked. The tapping grew clearer now, more insistent. Clara rounded the corner into her living room, expecting to see a tree branch scraping against the window. Instead, she stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat, her hand instinctively clutching the collar of her cardigan. There, perched on her windowsill, sat a bobcat. Its tawny fur glowed in the early morning sunlight, each hair seeming to shimmer with a life of its own, and its black-tipped ears twitched slightly as it watched her. But what struck Clara most were its eyes, amber pools that seemed to look right through her, holding wisdom that felt impossibly deep. "Oh my," she whispered, her heart beating faster. The bobcat didn't move, didn't even flinch at the sound of her voice. It just sat there, still as a statue, its gaze fixed on her with an almost human-like intensity. The morning dew on the window pane sparkled around its powerful frame. Clara took a hesitant step backward, then another, her slippered feet silent on the floor. Should she try to scare it away? Call animal control? The creature didn't seem aggressive, just watchful, almost as if it had been waiting for her. "Well," she said softly to herself, "I suppose if it's not causing any trouble." She turned toward her small kitchen, trying to act normal despite the wild animal at her window. Her hands trembled slightly as she filled her copper kettle with water and set it on the stove, the familiar routine providing some comfort in this unusual situation. While waiting for the water to boil, Clara couldn't help stealing glances at her unusual visitor. The bobcat remained motionless, those mysterious eyes following her every movement. There was something almost familiar about its steady gaze that made her skin prickle, like a half-remembered dream trying to surface. 10 minutes passed as Clara prepared her morning tea, measuring out the loose leaves into her favorite china cup, all the while aware of those eyes watching her. Finally, with a graceful movement that reminded her of flowing water, the bobcat stood up. It gave her one last penetrating look before leaping off the windowsill and disappearing into the woods behind her house, leaving only swaying branches in its wake. Clara let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Well, that was certainly different," she said to her empty house, trying to laugh off her unease. The sound of her voice seemed hollow in the sudden silence. The day passed normally enough, though Clara caught herself thinking about those amber eyes more than once. She went about her usual routines, reading, tidying, preparing meals, but her thoughts kept drifting back to her morning visitor. As evening approached and the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, she heard it again, tap, tap, tap. Her hand shook slightly as she reached for the curtain, the fabric soft and familiar between her fingers. Pulling it back just enough to peek through, Clara's heart skipped a beat. The bobcat was back, sitting in exactly the same spot as this morning, its unblinking gaze once again fixed on her. A strange mixture of fear and fascination washed over her as she stood there, wondering why this wild creature had chosen to return to her window, and why its presence felt so significant, so intentional. Clara sat at her kitchen table the next morning, warming her hands around a steaming mug of coffee. Golden sunlight spilled across the worn wooden surface as she gazed out the window, lost in thought about her unusual visitor from the previous day. The bobcat's intense stare had stayed with her through the night, making her wonder if she'd imagined the whole thing. Her fingers traced the familiar scratches on the table's surface, marks left by years of family meals and quiet mornings just like this one. Tap, tap, tap. The familiar sound made her heart skip. Setting down her coffee with trembling hands, Clara walked slowly to the living room. There it was again, the bobcat, its tawny fur catching the morning light. This time, instead of just watching, it raised one paw and gently scratched at the glass, leaving faint marks that seemed deliberate, almost purposeful. "What do you want?" Clara whispered, more to herself than the animal. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob as common sense warred with curiosity. The cool metal beneath her fingers seemed to pulse with possibility. After a deep breath, she turned the handle and opened the door, just enough to peer out. The bobcat took several graceful steps backward, its amber eyes never leaving her face. Its tail swished slowly as it moved toward the tree line, then stopped. It turned its head to look back at her, as if checking whether she was following, its ears twitching forward with attention. Clara's feet carried her to the edge of her small porch. The morning air was crisp, and dew sparkled on the grass between her house and the woods like scattered diamonds. Her worn slippers grew damp as she stepped onto the wet grass. The bobcat took a few more steps into the shadows of the trees, then paused again, watching her with what seemed like infinite patience. "You want me to follow you?" Clara asked softly. A shiver ran through her despite the warm morning sun. Something about the animal's behavior tugged at her, like a half-remembered dream. But the dark spaces between the trees made her hesitate, their shadows holding secrets she wasn't sure she was ready to uncover. "I must be losing my mind," she muttered, shaking her head. "Standing here talking to a wild animal in my nightgown and slippers." Her voice sounded small in the morning quiet. The bobcat remained at the forest's edge for another moment before melting into the shadows of the trees, its movements fluid and silent. Clara watched it disappear, unable to shake the feeling that it was waiting for something, waiting for her. The space where it had stood seemed to pulse with unspoken significance. Back inside, Clara tried to focus on her morning routine, but her mind kept wandering back to the bobcat. Wild animals didn't behave like this, did they? 2 days in a row, the same creature, acting almost like it had a purpose. She thought of all the nature documentaries she'd watched over the years, none of which had shown anything like this. She rinsed her coffee mug in the sink, her movements automatic as her thoughts churned. The sound of running water couldn't wash away her growing sense of wonder and unease. "It's just a coincidence," she told herself firmly. But even as she said the words, she knew she didn't believe them. Something deeper was at work here, something that whispered of mysteries waiting to be uncovered. The next morning, Clara grabbed a bucket of cleaning supplies and marched toward her father's workshop, determined to keep her mind off mysterious wildlife. The small wooden shed stood weathered but solid at the edge of her backyard, just as her father had left it 5 years ago, its cedar shingles grayed by countless seasons. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the old brass key in the lock. The door creaked open, releasing a musty smell of aged wood and metal that instantly transported her back in time. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating dancing particles in the air like tiny stars. Her father's workspace lay frozen in time. Hammers and chisels still arranged on pegboards, half-finished projects resting on the workbench, and stacks of papers yellowing in the corners, each holding forgotten sketches and measurements. "Oh, Dad," Clara whispered, running her finger through the dust on his favorite workbench. She could almost see him there, bent over his latest creation, his careful hands shaping wood into beautiful pieces, the way his forehead would wrinkle in concentration. For the next few hours, Clara sorted through decades of accumulated tools and memories. Each item she touched sparked a recollection. The hand plane he'd used to teach her about woodworking when she was 12. The measuring tape that always hung from his belt loop, its metal surface worn smooth from use. The coffee mug with its ring stains on the bench, still holding the pencil stubs he'd collected. Her back aching from bending and lifting, Clara decided to tackle one last item before heading inside. She picked up an old metal toolbox, its red paint chipped and faded, revealing patches of silver beneath. As she lifted the lid, a small envelope fluttered to the floor. Her heart quickened when she saw her name written in her father's distinctive slanted handwriting, each letter carefully formed as if he'd taken extra time with it. The paper felt delicate in her hands as she carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, containing just 2 sentences. "The Guardian has returned. Trust the signs." The words seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. Clara sank onto her father's old wooden stool, her legs suddenly weak. She read the words again, trying to make sense of them. "The Guardian? What signs?" The message was so unlike her practical, straightforward father, who had always preferred direct communication to riddles and mysteries. The evening light cast long shadows across the workshop floor as Clara sat there, lost in thought. Her eyes drifted over her father's tools, his projects, his whole life's work surrounding her, like a testament to his dedication. The note trembled slightly in her hands as she read it a third time, and unbidden, the image of the Bobcat's steady gaze flashed through her mind, its amber eyes seeming more significant now than ever before. Clara sat at her kitchen table, the letter spread out before her under the warm glow of her pendant lamp. Her fingers traced her father's handwriting as she read the words for what felt like the 100th time. "The Guardian has returned. Trust the signs." The paper was soft from repeated folding and unfolding, its creases well worn like the paths of her thoughts. She took a sip of chamomile tea, letting memories of her father wash over her. The familiar scent of honey and herbs filled her nose, reminding her of countless evenings spent together. Harold Williams had always been a quiet man, more comfortable with his tools than with words. But sometimes, usually while working in his shop or walking their property at sunset, he'd mention things about their family history. The sawdust would catch the fading light like golden glitter as he spoke. "This land knows us, Clara," he'd say, his eyes distant, calloused hands resting on the wooden fence posts he'd made himself. "It's been in our family for generations. There's something special here." His voice would always soften when he talked about the property, as if sharing a precious secret. At the time, she'd smiled and nodded, attributing his words to sentimentality. Now, sitting alone with his mysterious message, those conversations took on new meaning. Each memory seemed to hold a clue she hadn't recognized before. The last rays of sunlight filtered through her windows as she moved to the living room, settling into her favorite armchair. The old leather creaked softly beneath her weight, familiar and comforting. Her father's letter lay in her lap, its edges worn from constant handling throughout the day. Tap, tap, tap. The familiar sound made her heart skip. There it was again, the bobcat perched on her windowsill like a guardian statue. Its amber eyes seemed to glow in the fading light, intense and unblinking. The creature's tawny fur rippled slightly in the evening breeze. This time, instead of uncertainty or fear, Clara felt a wave of recognition wash over her. The animal's presence felt right somehow, like finding the missing piece of a puzzle she didn't know she was solving. A strange warmth spread through her chest. She stood slowly and walked to the window, drawing the curtain completely open. The soft fabric rustled under her fingers. The bobcat didn't flinch. Instead, it held her gaze steadily, its eyes reflecting something that seemed almost knowing. Its tail swayed gently, like a pendulum marking time. Time seemed to stop as they looked at each other. Clara felt a deep sense of calm settle over her, as if the bobcat's presence was somehow meant to be. The evening crickets began their chorus outside, a gentle backdrop to this extraordinary moment. In that moment, she knew with certainty that this wasn't just a random animal. It was connected to her father's message, to their land, to their family history. After what felt like minutes, the bobcat broke their shared gaze. With fluid grace, it leapt from the windowsill and disappeared into the growing darkness of the woods. The movement was so smooth, it barely disturbed the evening air. Clara pressed her hand against the cool glass, watching the spot where the animal had vanished. A few fireflies had begun to dance in the twilight, tiny beacons in the gathering dusk. Her father's words echoed in her mind. The guardian has returned. Looking down at the letter in her other hand, she knew she had to discover what he meant. Something deep inside her had awakened, like a long-dormant seed finally ready to grow. Clara rose before dawn, her determination to uncover the truth stronger than her desire for sleep. The attic stairs creaked under her feet as she made her way to the old trunk where her father's journals had rested untouched for years. Dust swirled in the beam of her flashlight as she lifted the heavy lid, the musty scent of aged wood and paper filling her nostrils. The journals were stacked neatly, their leather covers worn smooth from years of handling. A few brittle rubber bands that had once held them together had long since crumbled away. She gathered them in her arms, surprised by their weight, and carried them downstairs to the kitchen. Sunlight was just beginning to filter through the windows as she settled into her favorite chair, a steaming cup of coffee at her elbow, its familiar aroma helping to ground her racing thoughts. Clara opened the oldest journal, dated 1955. Her father's precise handwriting filled every page, a mix of detailed woodworking instructions and personal thoughts. The careful penmanship reminded her of watching him at his workbench, measuring twice before making a single cut. She skimmed through entries about cabinet joints and wood grain until a passage from 1956 caught her eye. "The brooch weighs heavy on my mind today. Mother spoke of it again, how it was the last piece of our family's fortune before the crash. Thomas betrayed that trust. I had to make it right, though the cost was steep." Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages, the paper crackling beneath her fingers. More entries followed, scattered between notes about furniture repairs and timber prices. "Retrieved the brooch today. The choice I made will haunt me, but family honor demanded action. Better to carry this burden alone than let the truth destroy what remains of our good name." Clara leaned back, processing what she'd read. The morning light had grown stronger now, casting long shadows across the kitchen table. She'd never heard about a family brooch or anyone named Thomas. Her father's words painted a picture of desperation and determination during those hard years. But the details remained frustratingly vague, like trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. She worked her way through 3 more journals, finding similar cryptic references woven between mundane daily observations. Her father's shame and pride seemed to war with each other in every mention of the brooch, though he never fully explained what happened. The coffee grew cold beside her as she lost herself in the past. The last journal was thinner than the others, its pages loose with age and its spine cracked from years of use. As she opened it, a folded piece of paper slipped free and fluttered to the floor like an autumn leaf. Clara picked it up, her heart quickening as she unfolded what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded to a soft brown, but she could make out familiar landmarks. The creek that ran behind their property, the old oak with the lightning scar, and a marked spot deep in the woods labeled with a simple X. Clara spread the worn map across her kitchen table, her fingers tracing the faded lines. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, highlighting the yellowed paper's crude markings. She recognized the meandering line that represented Miller's Creek, where she and her father used to skip stones on summer afternoons. "That must be the old lightning-struck oak," she murmured, tapping a rough X on the paper. The tree's split trunk had been a landmark since before she was born. Her memory painted a clear picture of the massive rock outcropping just beyond it, where wild blackberries grew in tangles during late summer. Taking a fresh sheet of paper, Clara began sketching a clearer version of the map. Her hand moved with purpose, adding details she remembered from countless childhood walks with her father. The familiar landmarks took shape: the creek's sharp bend, the cluster of pine trees, and the distinctive rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear. As evening approached, Clara felt a flutter of nervous energy in her stomach. She pulled out her old hiking backpack from the hall closet, dust coating her fingers. One by one, she gathered supplies: a sturdy flashlight with fresh batteries, her gardening gloves, and her fully charged phone. She placed each item carefully in the bag, checking them off a mental list. "Better be prepared," she said to herself, adding a bottle of water and a granola bar. The weight of what she was planning settled over her. Tomorrow she would venture into those woods, following a map that had been hidden away for years. Before heading to bed, Clara placed both maps on her nightstand, the original and her carefully drawn copy. The bedside lamp cast shadows across the paper, making the markings seem to dance. She found herself drawn to the window, pulling back the curtain to peer into the darkness. Part of her expected to see those familiar amber eyes staring back. But only the quiet night greeted her. That night, Clara's dreams were vivid and strange. The bobcat appeared, its fur silvery in the moonlight, its eyes like warm lanterns in the dark. It moved through the trees with silent grace, and in her dream, Clara followed without hesitation. The woods opened into a moonlit clearing, and she could feel the bobcat's presence guiding her, leading her towards something important. She woke with a start, her heart beating steady and strong. The dream clung to her like morning mist, but instead of feeling unsettled, she felt a deep sense of certainty. The map, the bobcat, her father's message, they were all connected, and she needed to follow where they led. The morning air nipped at Clara's cheeks as she stepped out of her house, map clutched in one hand and backpack secured over her shoulders. Sunlight filtered through the autumn leaves, creating dancing patterns on the forest floor. She took a deep breath, inhaling the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. "Well, here goes nothing," she muttered, checking the compass on her phone. The crunch of leaves beneath her feet filled the quiet morning as she made her way into the woods. She'd barely walked 50 yards when a familiar shape emerged from behind a thick pine tree. The bobcat's amber eyes met hers, and Clara's heart skipped a beat. "You again?" she whispered. The animal turned and walked ahead, its tail swishing gracefully. Clara followed, ducking under low-hanging branches and carefully stepping over fallen logs. The bobcat seemed to know exactly where it was going, pausing occasionally to make sure she was keeping up. "This isn't exactly easy for someone my age," Clara called out, her breathing heavy as she climbed over a particularly large fallen tree. The forest grew denser, the undergrowth thicker. Thorny bushes caught at her jacket, and Clara had to stop several times to check the map. Then she saw it, the massive oak tree her father had drawn. Its trunk was wider than any other tree around, its branches reaching up like ancient fingers toward the sky. "The oak tree," she said, touching its rough bark, "just like Dad drew it." The bobcat waited patiently as Clara oriented herself using the oak as a reference point. It led her further, moving with silent grace through the forest until they reached a small clearing. Sunlight poured down through a break in the canopy, illuminating a circle of ancient trees. Clara's eyes were drawn to the center of the clearing. There, among the fallen leaves and moss, was a patch of earth that looked different from the rest. The ground appeared slightly sunken, as if it had been disturbed long ago and never quite settled back properly. The bobcat sat at the edge of the clearing, watching intently as Clara approached the spot. She knelt down, her knees protesting against the damp earth, and began brushing away the blanket of leaves. Her fingers trembled as they dug into the soft soil, moving away decades of accumulated forest debris. Her hand struck something solid. Carefully, she cleared more dirt away, revealing the edges of a wooden box. It was weather-beaten and gray with age, its corners splintered and worn from years buried beneath the earth. Clara's hands trembled as she brushed away the last of the dirt from the wooden box. Despite its age, the container remained remarkably solid, though its surface was rough and weathered. She ran her fingers along its edges, noting the rusty but intact lock on its front. "Better not open it here," she whispered to herself, glancing around the clearing. The bobcat sat at the tree line, its amber eyes fixed on her every move. As she carefully lifted the box, its weight surprised her. Whatever was inside felt substantial. Standing up, Clara tucked the box securely under her arm. The bobcat's tail twitched once before it melted silently into the shadows of the forest. She couldn't shake the feeling that its job was somehow done. Back in her warm kitchen, Clara set the box on her dining table. Afternoon light streamed through the windows as she examined it more closely. The wood had darkened with age, and faint markings were carved into its surface. Perhaps initials, though too worn to read clearly. With steady hands, she worked at the lock with a small screwdriver from her father's toolbox. It took several minutes of gentle prying before the mechanism finally gave way with a soft click. Clara's breath caught as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in what remained of a velvet lining, lay an ornate brooch. Its silver surface gleamed despite years of darkness, intricate patterns weaving around several deep blue gemstones. Beside it lay a letter, its edges brown and fragile from water damage, and a small piece of fabric. She carefully lifted the fabric, recognizing the delicate embroidery, her grandmother's initials, stitched in faded purple thread. The letter's paper crackled as she gently unfolded it. Most of the ink had run, leaving the words difficult to make out, but several phrases jumped from the page. "Protect at all costs," and "The curse will follow." Clara's hands grew cold as she read, the weight of generations of secrets settling over her shoulders. She set down the letter and picked up the brooch. It felt heavy in her palm, its surface cool despite the warm room. Clara sank back in her chair, staring at the mysterious heirloom while questions swirled in her mind. The morning sun cast long shadows across Clara's kitchen table as she carefully spread out the contents of the wooden box. The brooch caught the light, its blue gemstones sparkling despite decades of being buried. Clara's hand shook slightly as she picked up the water-damaged letter, holding it gently to avoid further deterioration. Most of the words had faded into brown smudges, but certain phrases remained clear enough to read. Her eyes caught Great Depression near the top of the page, while sacrifice appeared multiple times throughout. Near the bottom, she could make out the words hidden to protect, though the context was lost to water damage. There has to be more to this story, Clara muttered, reaching for her father's journals. She opened the worn leather cover of the earliest volume, dating back to 1955. Her father's neat handwriting filled the pages, mixing everyday observations with family history. About halfway through the second journal, an entry made her pause. Margaret's brooch has haunted this family for 30 years now. She was so proud of it, a wedding gift from her mother. When the bank threatened to take our home in '32, she didn't hesitate to offer it as collateral. That loan saved us all. But Thomas... The writing grew darker here, pressed harder into the paper. Thomas betrayed us, a family friend for 20 years, and he stole it right from the bank's safe. Claimed it was lost. Margaret never recovered from that loss. Not just the brooch itself, but the trust that was broken. Clara sat back, her coffee growing cold beside her. She'd heard snippets about the Great Depression from her father, but he'd never mentioned this story. She turned more pages, finding scattered references to her grandmother Margaret and the brooch throughout the years. Another entry caught her eye. Margaret passed today. I've carried this burden for so long, knowing where the brooch ended up, but unable to tell her. The shame of it all. The way Thomas's betrayal broke her spirit. Some truths are better left buried. The weight of her father's words settled heavily on Clara's shoulders. She closed the journal, running her fingers over its worn cover. The brooch wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It represented her grandmother's sacrifice, her family's survival, and a betrayal that had echoed through generations. Looking at the brooch now, Clara understood why her father had hidden it away. But questions still nagged at her. How did he recover it? Why keep it secret all these years? What else hadn't he told her? The morning sun cast long shadows across Clara's kitchen table as she carefully spread out the contents of the wooden box. The brooch caught the light, its blue gemstones sparkling despite decades of being buried. Clara's hands trembled as she picked up the water-damaged letter again, squinting to make out more words beneath the stains and faded ink. Great Depression jumped out at her, followed by sacrifice, in her father's careful handwriting. Near the bottom, she could just make out the phrase, hidden to protect. The rest was too faded to read. Clara set down the letter with a sigh and reached for her father's journals. She'd only skimmed them before, but now she needed answers. Flipping through the pages, she found an entry from 1975 that made her pause. Margaret's brooch was more than just jewelry, her father had written. When the bank threatened to take our home in '32, that brooch was all Mother had left of value. She used it as collateral for a loan that saved everything. We thought we were safe then. Clara turned the page, her heart beating faster as she read on. James Turner, I trusted him like a brother. We all did. He knew what that brooch meant to us, but he took it anyway. Mother never recovered from that betrayal. Her oldest friend stealing the very thing that saved our family. Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she read about her grandmother's heartbreak. The journal entries grew more detailed, describing how the theft had torn apart not just their family, but the whole community. Her father's words were filled with a mix of anger and sadness that seemed to echo across the decades. She found another entry, dated years later. I finally found it. After all these years, I tracked down the brooch. But the cost of bringing this truth to light would destroy too many lives. Better to keep it hidden, to protect what's left of the peace we've built. Clara closed the journal, her mind spinning. The brooch gleamed innocently on the table, but now she saw it differently, not just as a beautiful piece of jewelry, but as a symbol of her family's survival, sacrifice, and deep betrayal. She couldn't help wondering what other secrets her quiet, hard-working father had carried to his grave, and why he'd gone to such lengths to hide this piece of their history. Clara sat at her kitchen table the next morning, pushing aside the journals to focus solely on the brooch. Sunlight streamed through the window, making the gemstones glitter like captured stars. She needed time to process everything she'd learned about her father's secret burden. Taking a deep breath, she lifted the brooch and turned it over in her hands. The metal felt cool against her skin as she traced its intricate design with her fingertip. That's when she noticed something odd. Tiny scratches on the back, forming a pattern that looked intentional rather than random wear. "What were you trying to do, Dad?" she whispered, running her thumb across the marks. They reminded her of something she'd read in one of the journals about a curse. Setting the brooch down carefully, she retrieved the specific journal and flipped through its pages until she found the entry. Her father's usually neat handwriting seemed shakier here, as if he'd written in a state of distress. "Sometimes I wonder if bringing the brooch back was a mistake. Since its return, nothing has gone right. Martha's illness, the farm foreclosure, Thomas and Sarah's falling out, even little Clara's accident at school. Logic tells me these are just life's normal hardships, but the timing, I can't help but question. Not that I believe in curses, but this brooch carries a weight heavier than gold." Clara's hands grew cold as she read further. Harold detailed more misfortunes: 3 failed harvests, a devastating barn fire, and the gradual distancing of once close relatives. While he repeatedly dismissed the idea of supernatural intervention, his words carried an undercurrent of doubt. "Perhaps it's not a curse in the traditional sense," he'd written, "but rather the burden of knowing what was lost and gained because of it. The price of protecting family secrets is steep." Clara set the journal down and looked at the brooch again. The beautiful piece that had once saved her family's home now seemed to radiate an aura of sadness. She thought about her father carrying this knowledge alone all those years, watching his loved ones struggle, while questioning if he'd made the right choice in bringing the brooch back. Her hand shook slightly as she set the brooch down on the table. The weight of its history, both known and hidden, pressed heavily on her heart. What had started as a curious family mystery now felt like opening a box of long-buried sorrows. She stared at the scratches on the back of the brooch, wondering what other secrets it might hold, and whether some things were better left undiscovered. Clara settled into her favorite armchair by the window, the afternoon sun providing perfect lighting as she held up her old magnifying glass. The brooch's surface revealed even more details under magnification, tiny scratches that seemed too deliberate to be random damage. "These look like tool marks," she murmured, tilting the brooch to catch the light. Her father had been meticulous with his carpentry tools. Perhaps he tried to open it himself. Standing up to get better lighting, Clara's hand trembled slightly. The brooch slipped from her fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. Her heart jumped into her throat as she quickly knelt to retrieve it. "Oh no, she whispered, her hands shaking as she picked up the brooch. One of the deep blue gemstones had shattered on impact, pieces scattered across the floor. But as she examined the damage, her breath caught. Where the stone had been, a small hollow space gaped like a tiny cave. Clara's fingers trembled as she carefully reached into the miniature compartment. She could feel something papery inside. With utmost care, she extracted a small yellowed piece of paper, folded into a tight square. Time seemed to slow as she gently unfolded it, worried the aged paper might crumble. A single word emerged, written in elegant, faded script. "Forgive." Clara gasped softly. She knew that handwriting. She'd seen it in old birthday cards and recipe notes carefully preserved in the family cookbook. It was her grandmother Margaret's distinctive penmanship, each letter flowing with graceful purpose. She carried the note to her dining table and sat down heavily, laying both the brooch and the paper before her. That single word, "forgive," seemed to carry the weight of decades. Clara stared at her grandmother's handwriting, feeling as though she was looking at a piece of a much larger puzzle. The message felt deeply personal, like a whisper from the past, but its meaning remained frustratingly out of reach. Clara settled into her favorite armchair by the window, the afternoon sun casting a warm glow across her lap. She held up the small magnifying glass, carefully turning the brooch over in her hands. The scratches along its surface caught the light, revealing patterns that seemed too precise to be accidental wear and tear. "These look like someone tried to pry something open," she muttered to herself, running her finger along the marks. As she shifted in her chair for a better look, the brooch slipped from her grasp. Her heart jumped into her throat as it hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. Clara quickly bent down to retrieve it, her hands trembling. "Oh no," she whispered, examining the damage. One of the deep blue gemstones had shattered on impact. But as she looked closer, something caught her eye. A hollow space behind where the gem had been. With shaking fingers, Clara carefully reached into the tiny compartment. She pulled out a small piece of paper, yellowed with age, and folded into a tight square. Her breath caught as she gently unfolded it, terrified it might crumble in her hands. There, in faded brown ink, was a single word: "Forgive." Clara's eyes widened in recognition. The graceful loops and precise strokes. She'd seen this handwriting before, in old birthday cards and recipe notes carefully preserved in the family cookbook. This was her grandmother Margaret's handwriting, unmistakable even after all these years. At her dining table, Clara placed the note carefully beside the damaged brooch. The single word seemed to carry the weight of decades, of secrets kept, hurts endured, and stories left untold. Her grandmother's message felt both like a whispered confession and an unfinished conversation, leaving Clara to wonder what, or who, needed to be forgiven. Clara sat at her kitchen table early the next morning, steam rising from her coffee cup as she carefully spread out the brittle pages of the note. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the faded handwriting that seemed to tremble across the page. "Dearest Margaret," the note began, "by the time you read this, I may already be gone. The weight of what I did has haunted me every day since." Clara's hand shook slightly as she read on. The writer described the harsh winter of 1932, when their children were sick and the bank was threatening to take their home. They had tried everything else, selling furniture, working extra jobs, even going hungry some nights. "When I saw your brooch that day," the note continued, "I knew it was valuable enough to save us. I told myself I would find a way to get it back to you, but shame kept me silent. Each time I saw you after, your kindness only made my guilt worse." Clara paused, wiping away an unexpected tear. She could picture it clearly, a desperate parent watching their children shiver in an unheated house, making an impossible choice. The writer described how they'd taken the brooch to a pawn shop 2 towns over, receiving just enough money to keep their family housed for another few months. The relief of saving my children was immediately poisoned by what I'd done to you, my dearest friend. Clara's throat tightened as she reached the final paragraph. The handwriting grew messier here, as if written through tears. I hope one day you can forgive me. I never deserved your kindness, but I never stopped cherishing it. She set the note down gently beside the brooch on the table. All these years, she'd grown up hearing whispers about betrayal and curses. But now she saw a different story, one of desperation, shame, and unspoken regret that had rippled through both families for generations. The brooch caught the morning light, its remaining stones glinting. Clara realized the real curse hadn't been supernatural at all. It was the heavy burden of secrets, guilt, and unspoken forgiveness that had cast such a long shadow over both families. Clara walked slowly through the woods, her boots crunching on fallen leaves. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating dancing patterns on the forest floor. Her mind felt as heavy as the humid air around her. She reached the stream where she used to play as a child, watching the clear water tumble over smooth rocks. The sound of rushing water brought back memories of summer afternoons, when her father would sit on a nearby log, whittling wood while keeping an eye on her. "Oh, Dad," she whispered, touching the rough bark of an old oak tree. "You carried so much alone." The realization of her father's burden hit her hard. Harold had protected everyone, keeping the theft secret, recovering the brooch, and bearing the weight of that knowledge in silence. She remembered the quiet moments when he'd seemed lost in thought, probably wrestling with decisions she never knew about. The stream gurgled peacefully as Clara sat on a moss-covered rock. She pulled out her grandmother's message, that single word, forgive, and studied it again. Had Margaret known about the theft? Or was this message meant for something else entirely? Clara wondered if her grandmother had sensed the bitterness growing in their family and wanted to stop it before it took root. A movement caught her eye. Across the stream, the bobcat appeared, its tawny coat glowing in a shaft of sunlight. It stood perfectly still, amber eyes fixed on Clara. There was something both comforting and mysterious in its steady gaze, as if it understood her struggle to make peace with the past. After a long moment, the bobcat turned and melted into the underbrush, leaving Clara with the distinct feeling that her journey through her family's history wasn't complete. Standing up, Clara brushed off her jeans and took one last look at the peaceful scene. Her father's letter was waiting at home. Maybe now she would understand its meaning more clearly. She started back along the path, her mind full of questions, but her heart somehow lighter than before. Clara walked slowly through the woods, her boots crunching on fallen leaves. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating dancing patterns on the forest floor. Her mind felt as heavy as the humid air around her. She reached the stream where she used to play as a child, watching the clear water tumble over smooth rocks. The sound of rushing water brought back memories of summer afternoons, when her father would sit on a nearby log, whittling wood while keeping an eye on her. "Oh, Dad," she whispered, touching the rough bark of an old oak tree. "You carried so much alone." Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought about her father's quiet strength, how he'd shouldered the weight of their family's secret all those years. She remembered his gentle hands showing her how to sand wood, his patient voice explaining the grain patterns. Behind his warm smile, he'd been protecting them all. "I wish I'd known," she said softly. "I could have helped you carry it." The stream bubbled past, its constant flow a reminder of how time kept moving forward. Clara wondered about her grandmother Margaret. Had she written that single word? Forgive, knowing about the theft? Or had it been a broader message about letting go of life's hurts? A movement caught her eye. Across the stream, the bobcat stood watching her, its amber eyes reflecting the dappled sunlight. It sat perfectly still, tail wrapped around its paws. Clara held her breath, feeling that familiar connection. After a long moment, the creature turned and melted into the undergrowth, leaving Clara with an overwhelming sense that there was more to understand. She brushed leaves from her pants and stood up straight. The walk home seemed longer than usual, her steps heavy with purpose. Her father's final letter waited at home. Maybe now she'd be ready to truly understand what he'd been trying to tell her. The morning sun streamed through Clara's bedroom window, warming her face as she opened her eyes. For the first time in days, she felt lighter, more certain of what needed to be done. The brooch sat on her nightstand, its damaged surface catching the light. "Time to make things right," she murmured, carefully wrapping the brooch in a soft cloth and placing it in her purse. The drive into town brought back memories of shopping trips with her father. They'd often stop at the small jeweler's shop to admire the window displays. Mr. Thomas had been there as long as she could remember, his skilled hands bringing new life to old treasures. The bell above the door chimed as Clara stepped into the familiar shop. The cases gleamed with polished jewelry, and the air smelled faintly of metal polish and leather. "Clara Williams!" Mr. Thomas's eyes crinkled with warmth. "It's been too long." She placed the wrapped brooch on the counter. "I need your help with something special, Mr. Thomas." His weathered hands carefully unwrapped the cloth. "My goodness," he breathed, holding the brooch up to the light. "This is exceptional craftsmanship. Depression era, I'd say." "It belonged to my grandmother," Clara explained, her voice soft. "It's been through quite a journey." Mr. Thomas examined the damaged gemstone and the intricate metalwork. "I can restore this," he said confidently. "Give me 3 days. I'll make it shine like it did when your grandmother first wore it." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she signed the paperwork. Leaving the brooch felt like letting go of a piece of her heart, but she knew it was necessary. Over the next 3 days, Clara immersed herself in her father's writings. She sat in his old workshop, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and memories, reading his careful script. Each page revealed more of his gentle soul, his quiet strength. "I understand now, Dad," she whispered, running her fingers over his handwriting. "You protected us the best way you knew how." The hours passed slowly as she waited for Mr. Thomas's call. She found herself rereading passages about her grandmother, seeing her family story with new eyes. The betrayal that had cast such a long shadow now seemed more complex, more human. When Mr. Thomas finally called, Clara's heart leaped. She drove to his shop, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The jeweler's smile was bright as he presented her with a small velvet box. Inside, the brooch gleamed as if newly made. The restored gemstone caught the light, and the metalwork shone with a warm patina. Clara's breath caught in her throat at its beauty. "It's perfect," she whispered, touching it gently. "Absolutely perfect." Clara gently placed the restored brooch on her dining table, its polished surface catching the morning light. Beside it, she arranged her father's worn journals and the yellowed letter from the family friend. Each item told a piece of their story, not just of loss and betrayal, but of strength and the power of forgiveness. "These deserve better than just sitting on a table," she said softly to herself. Remembering her father's workshop, Clara retrieved a beautifully crafted wooden display case he had made years ago. The wood was still smooth, despite its age, though it needed a good dusting. She ran her fingers along the intricate carvings on its edges, recognizing her father's careful handiwork. With a soft cloth, she lovingly polished the case until it gleamed. The rich oak grain emerged beneath her careful attention, bringing warmth to the aged wood. As she worked, memories flooded back. Her father in his workshop, the smell of sawdust, the sound of his quiet humming as he crafted beautiful things with his hands. "You would have wanted this, Dad," she whispered, carefully arranging the items in the display case. She placed the brooch in the center, its restored beauty drawing the eye. Around it, she carefully arranged the journals and letters, positioning them so their most meaningful passages were visible. The morning sun streaming through the window caught the brooch's gemstones, making them sparkle. As Clara worked, she felt a deep connection to her family's past. The weight of their struggles, her grandmother's sacrifice during the Depression, her father's silent burden of protection, even the desperate choice of their family friend, seemed to flow through her hands as she arranged each piece. We all did the best we could, she reflected, understanding now that their story wasn't about right or wrong, but about human beings facing impossible choices. The display began taking shape, transforming from a collection of old items into something meaningful, a testament to her family's resilience. Each piece told part of their story. The brooch itself, symbol of both hardship and hope. The journals chronicling her father's quiet strength. The letter revealing the deep remorse of someone who had made a desperate choice. Stepping back, Clara watched as sunlight played across the polished wood and restored brooch. The display case her father had crafted years ago had found its perfect purpose, housing these precious pieces of their family history. In that moment, she felt a profound sense of peace wash over her, as if generations of unspoken hurts were finally healing. Clara stood in her father's workshop, breathing in the familiar scent of sawdust and wood polish. The evening light filtered through the dusty windows as she opened an old chest, revealing Harold's cherished woodworking tools. Each chisel and carving knife was meticulously wrapped in oiled cloth, preserved with the same care he'd shown in all his work. "Maybe it's time," she whispered, selecting a small carving knife. The wooden handle felt smooth against her palm, worn from years of use. She chose a block of pine wood from her father's stored materials, remembering how he'd called it forgiving wood, perfect for beginners. Over the next few days, Clara discovered both the frustration and joy of woodworking. Her first attempts left her with splinters and uneven cuts. But gradually, she learned to feel the grain of the wood, to work with its natural patterns rather than against them. "Ouch!" she muttered, sucking on a nicked finger. But even the small injuries felt like badges of honor, connecting her to her father's patient dedication to his craft. The repetitive motion of carving became oddly soothing. As she worked, memories of watching her father in this very workshop flooded back. She recalled the peaceful expression on his face as he shaped wood into beautiful objects, understanding now why he'd spent so many hours here. One evening, as she carefully smoothed the edges of her carving, movement caught her eye. The Bobcat sat outside the workshop window, its amber eyes fixed on her hands as they worked the wood. Clara felt a wave of comfort wash over her, like receiving a silent nod of approval. Hours turned into days as she worked on her project. Slowly, the block of pine transformed into a simple but recognizable figure. It wasn't perfect. The proportions were slightly off, and some of the cuts were uneven. But Clara felt immense satisfaction as she added the final touches. With gentle hands, she placed her finished wooden figurine beside the display case containing the brooch. Though rough around the edges, it represented something more than just her first attempt at woodworking. It was a bridge between past and present, a new way to honor her father's memory while creating something of her own. Clara stood in her father's workshop, breathing in the familiar scent of sawdust and wood polish. The evening light filtered through the dusty windows as she opened an old chest, revealing Harold's cherished woodworking tools. Each chisel and carving knife was meticulously wrapped in oiled cloth, preserved with the same care he'd shown in all his work. "Maybe it's time," she whispered, selecting a small carving knife. The wooden handle felt smooth against her palm, worn from years of use. She chose a block of pine wood from her father's stored materials, remembering how he'd called it forgiving wood, perfect for beginners. Over the next few days, Clara discovered both the challenges and joys of woodworking. Her first attempts left her with splinters and small cuts on her fingers. The wood seemed to fight against her efforts, refusing to take the shape she intended. But she persisted, wrapping Band-Aids around her fingers and trying again. "Dad made it look so easy," she muttered, carefully guiding the knife along the grain. Slowly, her movements became more confident. The repetitive motion of carving brought an unexpected peace. The world seemed to fall away as she focused on each cut, each careful stroke of the blade. One evening, as golden sunlight streamed through the workshop windows, Clara looked up from her work to rest her eyes. There, just outside, sat the Bobcat. Its amber eyes watched her with what seemed like approval. Clara held her breath, not wanting to break the moment. The animal's presence felt like a blessing, a sign that she was honoring her father's memory in the right way. Hours turned into days as Clara worked on her project. Her hands grew steadier, and the wood began to yield to her vision. What started as a rough block slowly transformed into the shape of a small bird. Simple, but recognizable. She remembered how her father would whistle to the birds while working in his shop, and the memory brought a warm smile to her face. When she finally finished, Clara held up her wooden bird. It wasn't perfect. The wings were slightly uneven, and the beak was a bit crooked, but she felt immensely proud. She carried it inside and placed it carefully next to the display case containing the brooch and letters. The small carving stood as a testament to both her father's legacy and her own journey of discovery. Clara walked through the sunlit woods, her footsteps cushioned by years of fallen leaves. The path to the clearing felt different now, not mysterious or foreboding, but welcoming. In her arms, she carried a small sugar maple sapling, its leaves dancing in the gentle breeze. The clearing looked beautiful in the morning light. Shafts of sunshine pierced through the canopy above, creating patches of warmth on the forest floor. Clara paused at the spot where she had discovered the buried box containing the brooch. So much had changed since that day. "This feels right," she murmured, setting down her gardening tools. She chose a spot near the center of the clearing, where the sapling would have room to grow tall and strong. The soil was rich and dark as she began to dig, her hands working steadily with the small shovel. As Clara dug, memories washed over her. Her father's quiet strength, her grandmother's hidden message of forgiveness, the family friend's desperate choice and lasting regret. Each shovelful of earth seemed to stir up another reflection, another piece of understanding. The hole ready, Clara gently lowered the sapling into place. She took care positioning it, making sure it stood straight and proud. "This is for all of you," she said softly as she filled in the soil around the roots. "For the burdens you carried, the choices you made, the love you showed." Working methodically, Clara patted the earth firm around the young tree. Its leaves caught the sunlight, creating shifting patterns on the ground. As she stood to admire her work, movement at the clearing's edge caught her eye. The bobcat had appeared silently, as it always did. It sat watching her with those knowing amber eyes, its presence both familiar and mysterious. Clara felt no fear now, only gratitude for the strange guardian that had led her to discover so much about her family and herself. She remained still, sharing this peaceful moment with the creature that had guided her journey. The sapling stood between them, its leaves trembling slightly in the breeze, a living testament to growth, forgiveness, and renewal. The next morning felt different. Clara noticed the silence first. No gentle tapping at her window, no amber eyes watching her morning routine. She peered through the curtains, expecting to see the bobcat in its usual spot, but found only empty space. The windowsill looked strangely bare without its mysterious visitor. Throughout the day, Clara caught herself glancing out windows and checking the tree line. She hadn't realized how accustomed she'd grown to the bobcat's presence until it was gone. The house felt unusually quiet, and her thoughts drifted to everything that had happened since that first morning when she discovered the animal at her window. As evening approached, Clara grabbed her watering can and headed to the clearing to tend to her newly planted sapling. The young tree stood straight and proud, its leaves catching the golden light of sunset. While she carefully watered its roots, movement at the forest's edge caught her eye. There, sitting perfectly still among the shadows of the trees, was the bobcat. Its amber eyes seemed different now, gentler, almost tender. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she straightened up, careful not to make any sudden movements. The moment felt delicate, like a farewell between old friends. The bobcat's gaze held hers, and Clara felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Without this mysterious creature, she might never have discovered the truth about her family's past or found the peace she now carried in her heart. They stayed like that for several long moments, sharing a quiet understanding. Then, with graceful deliberation, the bobcat turned and walked into the depths of the forest. Its tawny coat melted into the shadows between the trees, until Clara could no longer distinguish its form from the gathering darkness. A bittersweet ache filled her chest as she watched it disappear. She knew somehow that this was the last time she would see her unusual guide. The bobcat's purpose, leading her to understanding and healing, was complete. "Thank you," Clara whispered into the evening air, her voice barely more than a breath. The words felt inadequate for everything the bobcat had helped her discover, but they carried all the gratitude in her heart. Clara settled into her favorite chair at her desk the next morning, a fresh notebook open before her. Sunlight streamed through the window, warming her shoulders as she picked up her pen. "It began with a tapping at my window," she wrote, the words flowing naturally onto the blank page. Hour by hour, Clara filled the pages with her story. She described finding her father's workshop, the mysterious letter, and the journey that led her to the buried brooch. Her hand moved steadily across the paper as she recalled the weight of family secrets and the path to understanding them. "The bobcat appeared like a guardian angel," she wrote, "leading me to truths I might never have discovered on my own." She detailed each encounter with the mysterious creature, how its amber eyes seemed to hold ancient wisdom, and the way it guided her through the woods with purposeful determination. As evening approached, Clara paused to flex her cramping fingers. The stack of written pages had grown impressive, filled with carefully documented memories and insights. She wrote about her father's quiet strength, carrying the burden of the brooch's history alone. She described her grandmother's hidden message of forgiveness and how it changed everything she thought she knew about their family's past. The real treasure wasn't the brooch itself, she wrote, but the understanding it brought. Each discovery peeled back another layer of our family's story, revealing not just pain and betrayal, but also courage, sacrifice, and ultimately, forgiveness. The single lamp on her desk cast a warm glow as Clara continued writing late into the evening. She documented every detail: the abandoned cabin, the ledger's revelations, and the profound peace she found in finally understanding the complete story. Her father's presence felt especially close as she wrote about his woodworking legacy and how it had connected them even after his passing. When Clara finally set down her pen, the completed pages told a story far richer than she had imagined. She looked out her window toward the darkened woods, satisfaction warming her heart. These words would ensure their family's legacy lived on, not as a tale of betrayal and loss, but as a testament to the power of understanding and forgiveness. Clara carefully placed the last printed page into the leather binding she'd selected for her memoir. The cover felt smooth beneath her fingers as she secured the pages with precise, measured movements. Her father would have appreciated the craftsmanship, she thought with a smile. Standing back, she admired how the bound memoir looked next to the restored brooch in the display case. The morning light caught the gemstones, making them sparkle against the dark wood of her father's handmade case. His journals and the family friend's note completed the collection, each item telling its own part of their story. In her kitchen, Clara gathered ingredients for her grandmother's apple pie recipe. As she peeled the apples and mixed the spices, she thought about how much had changed since that first morning when the Bobcat appeared at her window. The weight of unspoken family secrets, the burden of misunderstanding, it had all lifted, leaving her feeling lighter than she had in years. The familiar scent of cinnamon and baking crust filled her home as Clara settled into her favorite chair with the memoir. She opened to a random page and began reading about the day she found the buried box in the clearing. Each word brought back vivid memories: the soft earth beneath her fingers, the weathered wood of the box, the Bobcat's steady presence. Page after page, Clara saw her journey unfold. What had started as a mystery about a family heirloom had become something much more profound. She discovered not just the truth about the brooch, but also about forgiveness, resilience, and the healing power of understanding. The evening light grew soft as Clara continued reading, occasionally pausing to savor a bite of warm pie. She felt proud of how she'd captured everything: the fear, the curiosity, the gradual awakening to deeper truths. Her father's protective silence, her grandmother's wisdom, even the family friend's desperate choice. All of it now made sense in a way it never had before. Looking up at the display case, Clara whispered, "This is how we move forward," before turning out the light and heading to bed. Clara smoothed her hand over the leather binding of her memoir, admiring how the rich brown color matched the wooden display case beside it. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, making the restored brooch sparkle. She arranged everything carefully: her father's journals, the family friend's note, and now her own contribution to their story. In the kitchen, she pulled out her grandmother's recipe card for apple pie. The edges were worn soft from years of use, and flour stains dotted the corners. As she peeled apples and rolled out the crust, Clara thought about how different she felt from that morning weeks ago, when the Bobcat first appeared at her window. "Amazing how much can change in such a short time," she murmured, sprinkling cinnamon over the sliced apples. While the pie baked, filling the house with its sweet aroma, Clara settled into her favorite armchair and opened her memoir. She'd titled it simply, "The Guardian's Gift." Reading her own words brought back every moment vividly: finding the brooch, discovering the hidden note, and finally understanding the true meaning of forgiveness. The timer chimed just as she finished reading about her father's secret burden. Clara cut herself a warm slice of pie and continued reading, savoring both the familiar taste and the memories flowing through her mind. She smiled at the passages about the Bobcat. still feeling grateful for its mysterious guidance. "I never thought I'd write anything like this," she said softly, turning another page. The story wasn't just about a family heirloom anymore. It was about healing old wounds and finding peace with the past. Evening settled around her as she read, casting long shadows across the floor. The display case stood as a testament to everything she'd learned, not just about her family's history, but about herself. Clara closed the memoir gently and looked at the collection of treasures she'd gathered. Everything felt right, settled into its proper place at last. "This is how we move forward," she whispered, reaching for the light switch. With a quiet contentment in her heart, she headed toward her bedroom for the night. If you enjoyed the story of Clara, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.